So, dear students, welcome and welcome in such a great number today. Also, welcome to the online participants that have now been admitted to the Zoom. Also, very much welcome. And today we have the lecture on site. Usually we have the lectures online by the teacher online, but today we are very lucky to have a colleague from our law faculty delivering the lecture. And I'm very happy to introduce to you Professor Dominic Coppens from the Department of International Law of our law faculty. And Dominic is Professor of International Economic Law. And I can assure you that he pays attention to the sustainability dimension, the environmental dimension in his discipline in international economic law. So Dominic really applies a green perspective in his research and teaching. Moreover, Dominic combines his academic work with private practice, and often he can share super interesting stories from his practical experiences. Today, he will introduce us to the state of affairs of the negotiations for a global plastic treaty, with some specific attention to the position of the EU and its member states and the interplay with the EU's international Green Deal agenda. So without further ado, Dominic, you can take the floor for your lecture. Good luck.
Yes, Marianne has already set high expectations, and I can assure you, if you're professor of international economic law here at the faculty, with Marianne as a colleague, you cannot ignore international environmental law. So I'll do my best to combine both areas, but as Marianne said, I have that interest both as an academic, but also as a private practitioner, very much working on that intersection between economic law and environmental law. And the plastic treaty negotiations that we will discuss today is very much precisely in that space between those two areas. I'll start with the basics, sort of the recipe to make plastic. I think we've all know plastics, but if you think about the different steps of how do you try to cook plastic products, this is essentially the way it works. It's mainly 99% of our plastics is based on fossil fuels. That's really important to know for the rest of the lecture. Only 1% is bio-based, like based on corn, for instance. All of the rest, 99%, is fossil fuel based. Then you refine that fossil fuel into what is called monomers. You then combine those monomers to create polymers. That's the process of polymerization. You add some chemicals to it. You have around 13,000 chemicals that they add to plastics in order to increase the performance of plastic products, for instance, to make it safe, but also sometimes to reduce the production costs thereof. Around 1/3 of those chemicals are considered to be toxic chemicals, right? And then finally, you use those plastics to create any type of plastic products. I can do a bet with you that whatever you're looking at right now, you're seeing plastics at the moment. So plastics is a very successful product that has been introduced more or less since the beginning of the last century, and that to some extent has become a victim of its own success, right? And so what we see now with the current level of plastic use, the mismanagement of plastic waste, what we see is that it has a devastating impact on the triple planetary crisis. It has a devastating impact on all three aspects thereof. Climate change, plastics is responsible for around 5% of global emissions. Massive pollution and biodiversity loss as a result of plastic leakage, for instance, the physical contact of animals with plastics, but also the toxicity of plastics, including microplastics, may indeed harm biodiversity. Let's focus a bit more on pollution, on that impact. So this is essentially what the Global Business Coalition has put together. And this is a snapshot of what type of waste management is prototypically in place around the globe. What is immediately obvious is that we're in a green spot where recycling is the key way to manage plastic. Recycling is, as you know, a process through which you recover the material in a way that you can reproduce your plastic products or other products. You'll see that with South Korea, we're virtually alone around the globe who has essentially recycling up to scale. For many other countries, including a lot of other developed countries, what has been done in terms of waste management is essentially recovery. Recovery is, for instance, incineration. You burn the plastic and you try to recuperate the heat, right? It is sort of, and that's essentially then what is used. Some of it is indeed also landfilled within essentially the areas that are marked in yellow on this slide. And then the third one is essentially where it's not properly collected and where it ends up essentially in the environment. And that you see mainly in Africa, but also in some other states as well. So you clearly here already see something, what is called the pollution gap. We produce and we use much more plastic than we're able to recycle properly. Right? And here you see this pollution gap in numbers. This is from the OECD, a very recent study from the OECD. So you see that our plastic use is around 460 million tons per year. And that's expected to increase, even almost double by 2040 and triple by 2060 if we do not change our policies, right? So this is also all business as usual. If we work with the policies that we have today, this is what will happen with regard to plastic and plastic use. A big increase, mainly in non-OECD countries, because the increase of plastic consumption correlates with the increase of living standards and also the increasing population. But also even in the OECD countries, you see under existing policies an increase in the use of plastics. You see, as we saw on the previous slide in the figure, that there is also a big gap in proper waste management. Currently, we're only recycling around the globe. 9% of our plastic is properly recycled. You'll see with current policies that that will increase, but not that much, to 14% if we don't do more. But more importantly, you'll see that the mismanaged waste, this is the waste that ends up in the environment, will stay around the same in percentage terms, but in absolute terms, that will be much, much bigger, simply because it's the same percentage of a higher number. So we'll see all of the mismanaged waste that we see today, we see a big increase thereof over time by 2040. And that's also what you then see on the right-hand side. The blue ends up essentially in the environment, could be in rivers or the ocean. So that's the aquatic leakage, or it could be on land. And there again, you see a big increase from around 20 million ton today to around 30 million ton in 2040 if we don't change our policies. Some have said that there will be more plastics in the ocean than fish if we do not change our policies. And that would happen already by 2050. So there is an urgent need to change the way that we use, produce, and manage plastics. And that's essentially a task now on the shoulders of regulators, how to bring about that change. Two things that are really important to keep in mind if we think about this transition are that it needs to be sustainable and it needs to be just. Sustainable means that it might be easy to say, well, let's get rid of plastic and let's just use alternative products, right? That's not necessarily a good thing to do. It's only good if that alternative product is more sustainable in terms of emissions, but also in terms of other impacts on the environment than the plastic product. A typical example is your plastic bag, right? If you change your plastic bag for a very nice cotton bag and you use that cotton bag 10 times, then it's much worse in terms of environmental footprint. Your cotton bag is much worse than your plastic bag. So you have to think very carefully that you do not replace your plastic use by alternatives that might potentially be less sustainable. Very important to take into account. Second of all, what is also really important to take into account is that just transition. This is a picture that I took in Bangkok when I was there for the intersessional expert meetings in the plastic treaty negotiation, and I was walking around. And this shop had a nice label like plastic. So it was just all about plastics, right? And that just reminds you that if plastics is a really important product in a lot of parts of the world, it's cheap, it's affordable, it will also provide a lot of income to a lot of people around the globe. And so if you think about that transition, you also have to think you have to make sure that that transition is a just transition. Internally, that you compensate or that you take into account the social and economic impacts internally within a government, but also across governments, right? You want to make sure that it's not just the West or the rich countries that turn or that reap the benefits of the transition, but that you also take on board the interests of developing countries. And that's something that is also very much consistent with and required by the principles of international environmental law, like the Rio Declaration principles, including CBDR. So two things that are really important to take in mind and that to some extent also play out in the plastic treaty negotiations. So with that introduction, let's turn to what we're more comfortable talking about, regulators, right? Let's think about how can we bring about that change to our use and management of plastic and plastic waste. And what I want to do, as Marianne already said out in the beginning, I want to look at two pillars thereof. So two tracks which are going on at the moment as we speak. You have externally, you have the global plastic treaty negotiations. And then internally, at the same time, the EU is also taking a lot of measures that will affect plastics and even the trade in plastics. And I want to think about those two pillars and then at the end of the lecture, bring them together. Let's start with the global plastic treaty negotiations. They were launched in 2022, so not that long ago, with quite a high ambition. So the idea was to create a binding instrument to end plastic pollution. We already know based on the figures how difficult that will be. End plastic pollution even by 2040, right? And that such an agreement would have to be concluded ideally by the end of this year, 2024. Question mark of whether that will happen. We'll talk more about that later on. In terms of substance, what you will see under that treaty are essentially control measures. So measures that impose obligations on parties to that treaty, and then what is called means of implementation, which essentially is financing in principle for developing countries to help them with implementing the control measures. And again, we'll talk about the drafts that are on the table with regard to both control measures and means of implementation. As we know, in parallel, and the EU isn't waiting till this treaty is concluded to essentially move ahead. In parallel, the EU is adopting internally a lot of new measures that will also directly or indirectly affect plastics. And so the EU wants to implement the polluter pays principle, wants to move towards a more circular economy, and has therefore adopted measures that affect directly the product, the packaging, the waste shipment, the trade of waste, of plastic waste, and then company regulations. And it's really interesting. And if you're thinking about an interesting topic to look into, these are really interesting and far-reaching regulations and directives, and to think about what are the implications thereof for the trade of plastics, but also the production and the sale of plastics on the EU market. So the first one, and I'll be relatively short on most of them, is the Single-Use Plastic Directive from 2019, even before the official announcement of the Green Deal. You had that Single-Use Plastic Directive which banned certain types, a limited number of plastic products. You may have heard about cutlery, for instance, was banned. So those products for which there was clearly a sustainable alternative available were banned. There were also minimum recycled content requirements, but again, for a limited number of packaging. The second type of measure, which I think is really important, is the eco-design for sustainable products regulation. And you may have heard about that. That's even more recent. That's from this year. And here again, what the EU will try to do is essentially put in place sustainability criteria, performance criteria that go to the sustainability of a product, including its emissions, virtually, I'd say, to cut a long story short, of virtually all products. And many of those products, as we know, will also contain plastics, right? So that could be your fridge, your television, and so forth and so on. What the EU will do under that regulation is put in place very stringent sustainability requirements that those products will have to meet. Second bullet is packaging, and I'm going to part that because I have a separate slide on that. That's a very far-reaching regulation that is almost adopted. We're in the final stage of adoption of that one. Waste shipment, here again, important evolution. What the EU has done under the waste shipment regulation is ban the exports of plastic waste to non-OECD countries, unless those non-OECD countries will over time show that they're able to manage that waste in an equivalent way as is done in the EU. And then finally, and I find that also a very interesting area of law, also from my own practice, I see how meaningful this final set of regulations might be. This is essentially ESG type of regulation, where the EU is putting in place very far-reaching ESG directives on companies, a ESG type of measure that requires companies to disclose essentially their production and production process throughout their value chain. So that's CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and CS3D. And if you look at CSRD, for instance, what a company will have to do is, for instance, disclose its use of microplastics. In and of itself, it will not have to do anything about that. But of course, that will trigger that company to think twice about its use of microplastics. It may also result in regulation that in litigation that we already see happening in the EU against plastic and plastic producers, where some civil society entities or some other entities may go after a company that has disclosed certain types of information in terms of its own plastics use, right? So these disclosure requirements are also requirements that directly or at least indirectly will affect the plastic and plastic trade in the EU and with third countries. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn a little bit further into the internal EU Green Deal measures. And as I said, I wanted to look at one in particular. So this is the packaging and packaging waste regulation, which, as I said, is coming. And the idea here is very much similar to the ideas we have discussed before, is to try to turn to a circular economy. How do you turn to a circular economy? You try to reduce the production and use of that product. You try to reuse it as much as possible. If you can no longer reuse it, you try to recycle it, right? So you would do that also based on the waste hierarchy, where recycling is better than recovery of waste. That's in essence the objective of what is behind that regulation. All packaging would in principle be in scope, including packaging of imports, right? Any type of packaging would in principle be subject to that regulation with a few minor exceptions, and it would affect the entire life cycle of the product. Now let's think about the core obligations that will be developed under that regulation. So all packaging must be recyclable by 2030. There will be a restriction on the use of chemicals, and as we know by now, there are a lot of chemicals that are involved in plastics. Restrict chemicals for circularity reasons. To date, oftentimes restrictions on chemicals are put in place for health or safety reasons, right? But what will happen here is put in place restrictions on chemicals for circularity reasons. So if certain types of chemicals are not very good to recycle the product or to reuse the products, those might be subject to this regulation. So that's very innovative in essence. What is also really far-reaching is that there will be mandatory recycled content targets for plastics, for plastic packaging by 2030. And again, that will apply not just to domestic products, but also to an imported product. And it will be subject to sustainability criteria. So your recyclability, so the recycled content that you put in your product, will have to be recycling that is equivalent to the quality of recycling in the EU. We've already seen, based on that figure, how difficult that will be for third countries, right? So essentially what the EU is doing through this measure is imposing minimum recycled content requirements and saying that that recycling, irrespective of whether that happens within the EU or within a third country, needs to be of a very high level and needs to be of an equivalent level. What is interesting, if you look through the preamble of that regulation, is that the EU justifies that approach by reference to the plastic treaty negotiations, where it says, well, that's also a topic under discussion. So this is one of the reasons why we think this is appropriate for us to adopt this type of a mirror clause. You also have some other aspects of plastic packaging that will be regulated as well. Now, if we take a step back and we just think about these types of Green Deal measures that we've just discussed, what we see is like some recurring themes, right? You'll see a wave of unilateral regulation to achieve a higher environmental ambition. That's clearly the ambition of the EU with its Green Deal. But at the same time, the EU is very concerned also that this should not undermine the competitiveness of its own industry. And so what it's doing is essentially trying to level the playing field for import competition, like imposing your minimum recycled content requirements, not just on your domestic producers, but also do it vis-a-vis imports and require them even to be of the same quality than your own recycling. What it's doing as well is by regulating it in that way, indirectly, it's regulating the production process in a third country. And that I can tell you is also, as a trade expert, a very sensitive issue. Essentially, what the EU is doing is telling a third country, if you want to export to us, that's fine, but your production process needs to meet essentially our own production process within the EU. And that's very similar in other types of measures, like CBAM, for instance, EU deforestation regulation. There are many other examples where you see the same dynamic at play, raising similar issues as well. It's regulating the entire value chain from the raw material till the end of life. And it's doing so with carrots and sticks. So far, I've talked about sticks, right? You try to regulate, put in place restrictions, obligations on companies. At the same time, the EU is also providing carrots. It's providing subsidies, of course, only to its own industry, in trying to help that industry to make that green transition. So that's in a nutshell what I wanted to discuss about that internal pillar where the EU is trying to re-regulate plastics and plastic use and the management thereof. Now we move to the international arena. So we talk about the plastic treaty. You will say, well, we've seen this slide before. Yes, indeed. But this is the objective of the treaty. They want to turn this slide essentially to this slide, right? So the idea would be that plastic use should no longer be bigger than proper waste management of plastic, and therefore you, as a result, try to avoid plastic leakage. What I've done here with these circles is that there are very different views among countries that are negotiating the treaty. You have the ones that are the least ambitious, not surprising, they're called the like-minded countries. Not surprising, these are mainly the Middle East countries that are heavily using or producing fossil fuels. Those countries are saying, well, what essentially we need to do is not regulate the entire life cycle of the product. What we need to do is put all our eggs, or most of our eggs, into waste management. We don't need to reduce our production of plastic. The way we can achieve this equation is by boosting waste management. And they're saying that's what the treaty should be about. Downstream measures with regard to waste management. On the other side, you have other countries which are called the high ambition countries, including the EU, that say, and they're backed, I would say, by science, this is not going to be feasible. You can't just work on waste management. You have to improve waste management. You have to make it much better. You have to have the capacity to recycle around the globe. But at the same time, if we really want to stop plastic pollution, we will also have to restrict our plastic production, right? It needs to become more sustainable. So what these countries are saying is that on top of downstream measures, you also need to have measures upstream in the beginning of the value chain that affect the overall volume of plastic production. What they're also saying, the more ambitious countries, the ones that I have circled in purple, is that you have to address the plastic leakage, right? Plastic leakage is already there in the environment. It's growing every day until we can close this pollution gap, right? It's growing every day. You have to do something about it. You have to clean up the environment. You have to clean up the plastic that is in oceans. You have to clean it up when it is on land as well. This is, of course, as you can imagine, an ask that is mainly put forward by small island developing states that see a lot of legacy plastic pollution on their shore and that are confronted with a lot of plastic waste. So this is, in a nutshell, essentially the ambition of the treaty and the division among countries of how to achieve that ambition. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more. I'm going to take a look at the time, which we're doing fine. At the process. So this is, in a nutshell, the process of how these negotiations happen. So to date, from the beginning of 2022 until today, we've had 4 rounds of negotiations. The idea is, at least the ambition is, that we would conclude the negotiations by the end of this year. In the end of November, we have in Korea INC 5, normally the final round of negotiations that should, if it's successful, conclude the agreement. And you would then have a nice diplomatic conference sometime mid next year where countries would adopt the treaty. So that's the ambition. Who's trying to achieve that ambition? So who are the stakeholders involved in those negotiations? You have the INC Secretariat providing sort of administrative services. You have the chair, who you see here, Ambassador Luis Vallas from Ecuador. He's the chair. And then you have, of course, the countries, and with those countries, you have coalitions. It's the countries, of course, that are negotiating the treaty. You have coalitions which sometimes are regional, like the EU in itself is a regional coalition, the EU and all its member states. It's interesting because here it's, of course, the EU itself together with its member states, right? So they're negotiating, they're trying to reach internally a common position, and then they're taking the floor as the EU at the INC. I've heard that for INC 5, for some topics, the Commission will take the floor, more the upstream topics. For other topics, it might be member states that take the floor, but always, of course, based on a common position that they have agreed on internally. You also, of course, have other groups as well. You have the African group, you have the CARICOM group, you have the AOSIS group. So you have a lot of regional groups. But on top of that, you also have groupings along the lines of position, right, of interest. And I've talked about some of them already. You have the High Ambition Coalition, which is the coalition that includes the EU, but also includes some African countries, Latin American countries. So it's developed and developing that want to essentially combine their forces to essentially plead for ambitious treaty. And then you have the like-minded group on the other hand, who are the fossil fuel producing countries who are, I would say, the least ambitious in terms of treaty provisions that they would like to see. And finally, last but not least, you have quite a lot of observers. You have like civil society entities, you have industry, you have academics, you have the Scientists Coalition, for instance, as an interesting group of academics that try to help the negotiators to reach the agreement. And what is, I think, really interesting is the role that those observers can play. So I've participated in INC4. These pictures are from Canada. I've participated in that. It's really transparent. So you're allowed as an observer in the room. You can see essentially the treaty making happening before you. You can see the interaction. You can hear the negotiators taking the floor and defending their position, and you can also interact with them. It's also transparent in the sense that there is a publication of all of the observers. So it's not sort of secret. Everybody knows who's in the room, or at least who's in the building, and everyone has access to each other. So it creates for a very interesting dynamic that is much more open, I would say, than with regard to trade negotiations, for instance, where it's much more behind closed doors and very much less open vis-a-vis observers. Now, how are we doing in terms of draft, right? So we only have a month left to conclude the agreement. Where are we? So the way it has evolved is that it was quite difficult, if not a very difficult start. The first two INCs were essentially lost on procedural issues, not much progress on the text of the agreement. You can also imagine, based on what we've discussed before, how complicated it is, right? How different the interests are and how difficult it will be to reach an agreement. So what we have in terms of official text that is on the table is a draft compilation text that came out of INC4 in Canada. And I've taken a snapshot here. It's a text that looks a little bit like this. And this is, if you're in the negotiations, also what you see on the screen. You see it happening essentially as you speak. What is between brackets is not agreed on. And this is just a random snapshot, right? It's hard, if not impossible, to read it. Someone has counted the brackets in the document, and it's around 3,000 brackets. And it's just impossible to read it. It's a compilation of all of the options that all of the countries have put forward. And so you see you have different options, and then within options, you even have brackets and brackets and brackets and brackets, right? So it's 70 pages of all positions with brackets throughout. Now, if you try to reach an agreement at INC5 in Korea based on that text, you may just be able to read out, potentially, in 7 days, that text, and that's it, right? That's also what the chair realized. He said, well, this is not going to be possible. So what he did was a quite bold and courageous, but not without any risks type of process. He said, I'm going to try to take some ownership over the process. I'm going to try to distill what is in this draft compilation text into what is then called a chair's non-paper, right? So he tried to develop a non-paper over the last few months, which he discussed with the heads of delegation, where he said, this is what I think is achievable at INC5, and this is what I think should be used as the basis going forward for the negotiations to start with on day one in Korea. It's quite courageous because, of course, it's a selection, right? And with that selection, nobody is going to be really happy, right? Because the countries that are least ambitious will say, well, this is too much ambition. You're speaking for your own. You don't have any stake. You're not a country. You may not have the legitimacy to do so. The very ambitious countries will also be disappointed because, of course, it's a compromise. And so it's a very difficult type of approach. It's, in my view, the only feasible approach to get it done in Korea. But it's also very risky because the countries will need to accept it at least as a basis for the negotiations in Korea. So that was the chair's third non-paper was put out yesterday. So we're lucky that we organized it today. We're also lucky that it was already leaked in the press so that I can speak openly about it. And so let's have a look at what is in there. So these are the control measures. So like you're quite familiar probably with MEAs if you're following courses by Marianne, how MEAs look like. So you have control measures on the one hand, and then you have means of implementation on the other hand. And so this is essentially what is on the table and to some extent reflected in the non-paper. So the supply, that's very much upstream, right? We've talked already about those countries that say, well, we cannot close the pollution gap if we do not reduce our plastic use. So ideas that have been circled since the very beginning, including put forward by civil society, by NGOs, is to say, what you need is a reduction target. You need a global reduction target, either qualitative or quantitative, and then you need countries to make a contribution to that overall target. Some may think a little bit like the Paris Agreement. You have a target in terms of climate, and you have national plans, national determined contributions towards that end. You could even go beyond that, and you can be more strict than what is done under the Paris Agreement, where you set for each country quantitative limits. That's definitely not what we will get, right? We will, if at all, we will get some soft language, in my view at least, on supply. What you see on the slide in red is where the chair has not proposed any specific language. He has set out some thoughts, what he thinks might be covered, but he hasn't sort of proposed specific language. Here he has said, and so you'll see there already that it's quite, and that reflects also the very stark opposition against those types of measures. So here you see what he has set out is quite soft. It's sort of acknowledge that we need to have sustainable production levels, encourage countries to cooperate towards developing an objective on it, some reporting obligations that might be put in place with regard to the overall level of production, but nothing that would come close to targets that will reduce the overall volume of plastic that we produce in the world. The second topic is more product specific, right? And so the second topic is sort of thinking about plastics and chemicals of concern that we as countries may agree on we want to phase down or phase out over time. Here again, he hasn't put forward language, but some ideas, but also with an opt-out type of system. You have that under other MEAs as well, right? You have sort of that idea that we're going to create a list approach. We're going to say that this type of plastic product we agree we can phase out or phase down or phase out. And you allow countries to say, well, I'm not going to accept this one. And at least temporarily, I will not be subject to that obligation. That will apply or may likely apply towards plastics, the plastic product itself, but also towards those types of chemicals of concern. There are also some soft obligations on the design of products. As I said already, in the EU, we have very far-reaching obligations that will be put in place on the design of products. What we will see on the treaty is probably much softer, right? It's sort of an encouragement on countries to take steps to put in place measures that will increase the sustainability and the circularity of products. What you see for all these types of measures is that they will seek to have a balance or to find sort of a balance between what is determined at an international level and what is left to national governments, right? And so to some extent, what I think the chair hopes to achieve is that there will be guidelines that the conference of the parties will develop, for instance, on what is sustainability, what are sustainable alternatives, and that those guidelines will to some extent help countries to implement this type of obligation. Emission and releases, that's essentially the chemicals of concern, the plastic pellets and the microplastics that throughout the life cycle of a plastic product, including with its transport, may be released into the environment. That's a shall obligation. And I've put the word shall in because if you've negotiated MEAs or if you've looked into the obligations, the verbs are probably the most important aspect of the treaty. And so if you see a shall, then it's a mandatory obligation, right? So here the idea would be that at least they shall take measures. It's not necessarily a very demanding shall, but at least it's a shall take measures to avoid or reduce the emissions and releases of those microplastics and other things that are of concern. Then on waste management, we've talked already about how important waste management is, but also how it's definitely not yet sound and safe around the globe. Here, there would be also, again, that obligation to put in place an environmentally sound and safe waste management system, leaving open what that means. There might be some link to what the Basel Convention is doing in determining safe and sound waste management. So here there could be an obligation on countries to do so, and with an encouragement, quite soft again, on countries to put in place very specific measures like EPR, extended producer responsibility types of measure that essentially require companies to pay for the price, to pay for the cost of waste management. There might also be control of exports of plastic waste. Legacy plastic pollution, we've talked about how important, how omnipresent legacy plastic pollution is. Here it's cooperate to address, right? And that's, I think, in my view, definitely a disappointment for the small island developing states. If this is what we're gonna do on legacy plastic pollution, which is its legacy by name, right? It's gonna grow as we've seen over the next decades until we close that pollution gap. It's very little in my view, in terms of obligation. Just transition, again, an idea, and it's good that it's reflected in the treaty that there is that need for just transition, but it's, again, the language on it, in my view, is quite soft. To be seen where this will be used as the basis for the negotiations. As the chair also said in its non-paper, he's not taking the compilation text off the table, right? Officially, that's still the text that was agreed on at the end of INC 4. So officially, of course, it's still on the table, and countries could very well say, we want to have other types of measures that go beyond what you see on the slide, or that are more demanding in terms of obligations than what is put forward in the non-paper. So all remains to be seen what will happen at INC 5. Then that's for control measures. This is means of implementation. Means of implementation, as I said in the beginning, it's really important. It's in particular important for developing countries, right? To lack the financing to implement the control measures that are put in place. It's a problem, I would say, a chronic problem of MEAs. There is simply not sufficient financing foreseen for developing countries to implement their obligations in a way that is fair and equitable. You see that in the climate regime. What you may want to prevent here is that the same happens with the plastic treaty. One big discussion, and I won't talk much about that, although in the negotiations it's a very hot topic, is the financial mechanism. Which entity will be responsible for reallocating the financing to developing countries? Here we have a divide between developed and developing countries. Developed countries want to use an existing fund, such as the GEF, the Green Environmental Fund, which is developed under the UNFCCC. Developing countries don't want to use that fund. They want to create a new dedicated fund under this treaty that, in their view, would be much more efficient in allocating the funding to developing countries. So a very big topic, and that's also why this is all on red here. There is no draft text language by the chair because it's too contested. The sources of financing, that's really important as well. There is a very big financing gap. If you look at the financing costs on developing countries to really do away with plastic pollution, and you look at the available financing, including all of the public financing, the ODA, there is a massive gap. And that was something that clearly came out of the meetings in Bangkok, where there was a lot of disagreement on a lot, but there was one thing on which I couldn't hear any disagreement, and that's the financing gap. We all agree that the money that is on the table and that public sources will be able to provide will not be enough. This is also reflected in the co-chairs report. The co-chairs report is a summary of what happened in Bangkok that explicitly recognizes that indeed there is that financing gap and that private financing will be key to close that gap. There are some ideas on how private financing may help and may complement public financing, EPR schemes. But EPR schemes, of course, if you develop an EPR scheme, that money stays nationally, so it doesn't really help a developing country. And you have a plastic polymer fee. This is essentially how I today involved in the negotiations. So I'm engaged by the philanthropic Minderu Foundation, and they're trying to test an idea of whether we could include in the treaty a plastic polymer fee. So I'm happy to talk for quite some time about that fee. In essence, what it would be is a small fee that would be imposed on primary polymer producers. So in the beginning of the value chain, those companies that are engaged in what we call polymerization, they would have to pay a small fee, and the bulk of the money of that fee would go to developing countries to close that financing gap, to help them with addressing legacy plastic pollution, just transition, but also industry transition, and so forth and so on. So that's an idea I'm working on, and that's also the reason why I will be at INC 5 to discuss with countries that idea. What I think is really important to keep in mind, and that's also really important, I think, for the EU to keep in mind, is that as a negotiator, an African negotiator told me earlier this week, you want to make sure that the level of ambition on means of implementation is the same level of ambition as with regard to the control measures. You cannot expect developing countries to adopt ambitious control measures if you do not give them the financing they need to implement those. It's simply not possible. It's also inconsistent with the principles of international environmental law like CBDRC. Now, let's bring those two worlds together. Liam, I'm looking at you, whether I'm going over time. Excellent. So let's bring the EU internal Green Deal measures and this international story. Let's bring those two stories together. And let's do it in 5 minutes to keep Liam happy. So this is in a nutshell where the two stories come together, right? So what we see on the right-hand side is, I would say, very demanding, unprecedented types of regulations affecting not just production in the EU, but also imports. What will that mean for an EU producer? Is that they shouldn't be that much concerned about the plastic treaty. That will not make much, if any, difference for them. If they tick all of the boxes of the EU internal measures, then definitely they will be fine elsewhere, because the control measures that are currently on the table are far less demanding than what the EU will impose in terms of measures, right? So for the EU producers, I think the story is, this is good, okay? This is not going to be much more demanding. It's already quite demanding, if not very demanding, what the EU is requiring under its internal law. The story is, of course, very different for non-EU producers. For non-EU producers, they may think, well, this is quite fine, the control measures, meeting the control measures. Of course, it's never imposed on a company. The idea would be that it's implemented at a national level, but then that will trickle down to a company. If a country adopts what it needs to adopt under the treaty with what is now on the table, that will not be very demanding, right? And so that will not be very demanding, which I think is, of course, from an environmental perspective, not something you would want to, but also it may give a false hope on those industries that they'll get away with just implementing those national laws. If they're exporting to the EU, like many of them do, they will need to meet much more stringent requirements than the requirements that are indirectly will be imposed on them under the treaty. It also puts an even higher premium, in my view, on the means of implementation. So those means of implementation are important for consumers and companies in third countries, in developing countries, not just to enable them to implement the control measures, but also it will be really important that they have the financing to have this green transition in order to be able to meet the market access requirements that the EU is putting in place. So for them, I would say for developing countries, there is a high premium on means of implementation, not just within the four corners of the treaty, but also if you take a broader perspective and look at the measures that countries or regions are putting in place unilaterally. And again, and I'm almost done, this is just a visualization thereof, right? And if you would meet the requirements that are currently on the table with regard to waste management, then the colors on the slide may turn more yellow and more greenish, but not very green, right? However, as we have discussed before, if you want to keep exporting to the EU, and you need to do it in the way, and you need to have minimum recycled content up to the quality of recycling in the EU, then in order for you to export, to keep exporting, it's going to be vital that you create waste management infrastructure that is able to recycle it. And here you see a very interesting example of essentially how the EU is using its market power to export its sustainability standards, right? And so you'll see that from a market access perspective, it's going to be really important for those countries to have proper recycling facilities in place. This brings me to the conclusion. The hope still is that we will have an ambitious and an inclusive treaty. That's going to be really demanding. If you see what is now on the table, it's probably going to be, or I think what they're looking for is an agreement that is strong enough as a basis now, and that then be complemented by decisions by the Conference of the Parties and could become stronger over time, although there is a limit on what you can do. What I think is really important is that it's ambitious in terms of control measures. It's equally ambitious in terms of means implementation. If it falls short, again, I think the main burden thereof will be on developing countries, because in that situation, they will not get the financing that they need for that green transition, which is bad for the environment. It doesn't really matter if we only turn green, we need the world to turn green, but it will also put a lot of costs on them that otherwise, for which otherwise they would get financing under the treaty. And that brings me to a final point. You see today a wave of unilateral measures, then you see attempts for a multilateral green transition, and you see how this wave of unilateral measures to some extent comes at the cost of developing countries. They have a high stake in keeping the multilateral system in place, because then they have a say in it. They can sit around the table, they can decide also what is sustainable or not in those negotiations, but also they will get the financing that will help them to support that green transition. Thank you.